there was a coup attempt in Russia this weekend, and I use the term coup pretty lightly. It didn't get to the point where a lot of people were killed. It didn't get to the point where the Kremlin was openly attacked, but it was on the way to that. So I want to walk through the timeline for everyone so they can know kind of what happened. Most of this will be according to The Guardian. If you want to go read it, go check out The Guardian. They kind of gave a little bit of a timeline for what happened, and it was actually a really great article. That's what I'm going to be using as my source for today's podcast. So, giving you timeline Thursday, and I'm going to butcher these names. I apologize. I always do. I don't know Russian like at all. I don't understand Eastern European names and pronunciation, but we're going to go for it. So, on Thursday, it's Prigozhin, I believe. That's the pronunciation I'm going to use. Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner mercenaries, had basically an online rant talking about Shoigu. Now, if you don't know who Shoigu is the military general delegated by Putin in charge of Ukraine. Okay, obviously there's been a lot of controversy with people. We're not real sure how unified Russia is on the Ukrainian war, especially with all the casualties they've lost. The Russian military is, on a world scale, pretty large, but a lot of their military is very outdated, and there's a lot of reporting going on that they're actually using equipment from World War II, which is, it's been almost 100 years. It's old. But Ukraine, on the other hand, is using NATO equipment, so it's very new. In any case, Prigozhin I don't know if it was a tweet, but he was kind of talking just online about Shoigu and basically how he has duped Putin into this Ukraine war. In response to that, Shoigu and Putin basically dissolved the Wagner mercenary group. It was a state-sponsored mercenary group, and essentially the way they dissolved it was by saying that they had to sign in to the military instead of just through the Wagner group in order to be part of the Russian military. Essentially just saying, hey, your group's done. You can be part of the military, but that's it. So obviously this made Prigozhin very upset. A missile was actually fired into a Wagner camp soon after. We don't know for sure where it came from, but there was a lot of speculation that this came from Putin. It killed, we think, around 15 men. We're not for sure, but Prigozhin came out and said that the losses were really heavy. He then responded the next day by marching on a city called Rostov-on-Don, and he basically took it over. So this is a big deal at this point. I mean, you literally have a military general at war with the president of his country, and that's scary stuff for Russians. Ukrainians, on the other hand, were really happy. We'll talk about that more in just a second. What's interesting about Prigozhin going into Rostov-on-Don is that the people kind of welcomed him. Like, you can see, if you go to the Guardian article or you can look it up online, you can see pictures of people. There were tanks there. There were a lot of people and just, a lot of military people in military garb. And it looks very serious, but the locals kind of come out. You can see a lot of selfies with people in tanks. No one was really concerned. Prigozhin didn't meet any resistance in this city. And in fact, it went so far as the military officials in the area that were not part of the Wagner group, they kind of, welcomed Prigozhin there. And so he kind of just took over the city without having to fire a single shot. Other military officers, like I said, met with Prigozhin and accepted him and called for a resignation of Shoigu as well. So for those of you who aren't as well versed in coups, that is how a coup usually starts. Coups almost always are going to be a military coup. It starts with a high-ranking officer in the military that tends to get other military officers on his side, and they then try to assassinate the sitting president or king or whatever the executive is in that country. I want to talk about the title sponsor for this podcast, Gulag America. One thing that I'm very passionate about is that we do not want America to turn into Russia, which is what we'll talk about today. That is why I've partnered with Gulag America. Gulag America can hook you up with high-quality apparel that looks as good as it feels. Founded by an Army and Reserve veteran, Gulag America has t-shirts, long sleeves, and hoodies that are great for both men and women. My personal favorite is a shirt. It says, "My pronouns are a 9mm," and I'll be wearing a shirt next podcast so you guys can see. I'm always wearing my polo shirt, so I know it's gonna be quite the contrast. But I have one question for everyone. Do you even know what a gulag is? Often the term gulag refers to literal prisons in Russia, but as I've discussed on this show, we have gulags taking over the West all the time. Some of these, just to name a few, are the military-industrial complex as well as the mainstream media. For a limited time, if you use my code JoshCar10, that's one word, JoshCar10, you will get 10% off at Gulag America. Again, that's JoshCar10 at Gulag America. Great quality and great designs. So up until this point, and I think we're at Saturday now, this looks like it's a full-blown coup. Like, this is very much on its way to a lot of violence and a change in leadership in Russia. Putin then went on TV and called it treason, which, I mean, it is. Taking over a city in your own country is treason. And so Putin called it treason, basically denounced Prigozhin as a military officer, and started to defend the Kremlin with his own military. So that's showing very clearly that Putin is feeling very threatened. He literally started setting up blockades around the Kremlin. There was a lot of aircraft in the area defending the Kremlin, and this is when people internationally started thinking, this could lead to a lot of violence and a change in leadership potentially. Now, between the road to the Kremlin and Rostov-on-Don, which is where Prigozhin is, there were about 15 more casualties, mostly because of bombings and artillery. So basically a convoy started from Rostov-on-Don towards the Kremlin, and most of the fighting was because of artillery, so it was a lot of bombings coming through. So there wasn't a lot of man-on-man contact, but about 15 of I'm messing up his name. Prigozhin's his men were killed as they started marching. Now, this is where it gets super interesting. Out of nowhere, so we've got military officer marching towards the Kremlin. Putin is sitting in the Kremlin defending it, hunkering down. At this point, everyone's thinking, wow, like, we're going to have like a serious battle here. Out of nowhere, the president of Belarus said that a deal was made between Putin and Prigozhin, and Putin and Prigozhin then later came out and agreed to it publicly. They also agreed that there was a deal made. Now, this is super interesting because up to this point, we didn't know that the president of Belarus had anything to do with this. And people are still figuring out what part does he play. But for those of you who don't know, Belarus is so they share a border with Russia. They share a border with Ukraine. And in fact, they are like really close to Kiev in Ukraine. So there's a lot of, they have a lot of pull or a lot of incentive, I guess, to be involved with the Ukraine-Russia war. And we don't know what happened with the president of Belarus and what he was able to broker. But there's a few things that I think are clear from this deal that I want to talk about. The first is, what are the new powers established, essentially? Because there was a deal made. We don't know who was on the up. We don't know if it was Putin or Prigozhin who was kind of more advantageous. And so it'd be reasonable to assume that the one who was more advantageous is going to walk out of this with more power. If I had to guess, it might be Prigozhin. I would not be surprised if Putin actually made a deal with Prigozhin and basically gave him some more power. Perhaps we'll see him be in charge of the Ukrainian war. I kind of doubt that because he's not a fan of the Ukrainian war. Perhaps he'll be offered literally just a payout. But if I had to guess, he is going to be switching roles in the executive and in the military in Russia. But this goes to, I guess that's my first theory. My second theory, which I believe is probably a little bit more accurate, is that between Prigozhin and Putin, there is basically a dead man walking at this point. One of them is going to be killed. I don't know how this deal was brokered. Perhaps the president of Belarus approached one and talked about how they could kind of make this problem go away quietly. And so we could see some sort of an international conflict where Belarus gets involved. But I'd be really surprised if both Putin and Prigozhin make it through the next year being alive. And between the two, I would have to guess that Prigozhin is he's the one that's a dead man walking. I'd be really surprised if Putin has lost enough pull at this point that especially if the president of Belarus got involved, that leads me to believe that Putin and the president of Belarus were the ones talking, not Prigozhin and the president of Belarus. So I think it's safe to say my prediction is in the next year we're going to hear that one of them has been killed. Obviously, if Putin is killed, that's going to be a huge deal. If Prigozhin is dead, not as big of a deal. And we could even see Shoigu get roped into that as well. That could be part of the deal. It seemed like originally Prigozhin's critiques were of Shoigu, not as much as of Putin. So we may see that Shoigu is killed or at least taken off being a high-ranking military officer in Russia. One thing that's really interesting, it's important to keep in mind, is that a lot of people were really excited about this. They were excited about the fact that Prigozhin might take over for Putin. Make no mistake, this guy is a super bad dude. Killed a lot of people. He's just as much of a thug as Putin is. And power vacuums can be really dangerous when we're talking about a nuclear country like Russia is. Russia has a ton of nukes. And although we don't like Putin, so far Putin has been in a leadership position for a long time and has not resorted to nukes. And so I think the media right now are really excited about the fact that there could be a power switch. I would really caution against people celebrating that. It could get much, much worse. At the very least, Putin talks to the United States president, and there is a level of understanding, whereas Prigozhin may be even worse than Putin, which is saying a lot. The other thing that makes more sense, so I'm not okay with the media really celebrating it. I think that's irresponsible for them to do because just with our knowledge of coups in history, it's not going to get better for Russians, Ukrainians, or the world if there's a power vacuum there. The Ukrainians are obviously really hyped about this, and that I totally get. Of course, they're not going to want their enemy to be unified, and so that's definitely a silver lining for Ukraine. Perhaps in that negotiation, Prigozhin was able to somehow convince Putin to weaken on Ukraine, and perhaps we'll see a close to that war come, but only time will tell.